In the strangest vision in the entire Bible, a prophet in exile looked up at a storm and saw something that should not have been possible, a wheel that moved in every direction at once without ever turning, its rim covered edge to edge in countless staring eyes. This is not folklore or a fever dream. It is scripture, one of the most detailed and most debated visions ever recorded, and 26 centuries later scholars, mystics, and even conspiracy theorists still cannot agree on exactly what the prophet Ezekiel saw that day. The year was around 593 BC. Jerusalem had already been humbled once by the armies of Babylon, and a young priest named Ezekiel was among the thousands of Judeans dragged from their homeland and resettled far to the east. For generations, Judah's own prophets had warned that turning away from their covenant would eventually cost them their land. Ezekiel had grown up hearing those warnings. Now, exiled on foreign soil, he was living inside their fulfillment. Babylon itself was the greatest city on earth, ringed by towering walls and gates faced in glazed blue brick, lions and dragons marching in relief across their surface, a skyline meant to overwhelm anyone who entered it. But Ezekiel did not live inside that city. He lived among fellow exiles at a settlement called Tel Aviv, on the bank of the Chebar, a great irrigation canal running out from the Euphrates near the city of Nippa. He was 30 years old, the exact age a priest would normally begin his temple service. Instead of the temple in Jerusalem, he sat among refugees on a foreign riverbank, his priesthood with nowhere left to be performed. A few years earlier, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar had besieged Jerusalem, stripped its temple treasures, and deported its king, its nobles, and its priestly class, Ezekiel among them, in the first of what would become several waves of exile. Then, on the 5th day of the 4th month of the 5th year of exile, an ordinary day beside that canal, Ezekiel says the heavens themselves opened, and he saw visions of God. It began, he wrote, with a whirlwind coming out of the north, a vast cloud, fire flashing continually within it, and a brightness around it that lit the whole sky like burning metal. In the middle of the fire, he says, was a glow like amber, like glowing metal pulled fresh from a furnace. And out of that fire, 4 living beings began to take shape. Each had the general form of a man, but almost nothing else about them was human. Each one had 4 faces, and each one had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot, gleaming like burnished bronze fresh out of the forge. Under their wings, on all 4 sides, were the hands of a man, and each of the 4 beings had all 4 faces, and all 4 wings, at once. Notice, too, what Ezekiel never once calls these beings. He never uses the Hebrew word for angel, malach, messenger, the word scripture uses everywhere else for a spirit sent from heaven. These 4 creatures belong, in his own careful language, to an entirely different, higher order of being. The 4 faces ancient tradition holds were these: the face of a man in front, the face of a lion on the right, the face of an ox on the left, and the face of an eagle behind. Centuries later, Christian tradition matched each of the 4 faces to a different gospel writer, the man to Matthew, the lion to Mark, the ox to Luke, the eagle to John, a symbol still carved into cathedrals and painted into illuminated manuscripts today. 2 wings of each creature stretched upward until they touched the wing of the being beside it, forming a single unbroken canopy overhead. The other 2 wings covered their bodies. They did not turn as they moved. Each one simply went straight forward, toward whichever of its 4 faces happened to point the way it needed to go. Their appearance, Ezekiel wrote, was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches. Fire moved up and down among them constantly, bright, and out of the fire went lightning. And the living creatures themselves, he says, ran back and forth like a flash of lightning, too fast and too strange for the eye to ever hold steady. Even the numbers themselves seemed deliberate. 4 faces, 4 wings, 4 wheels, 4 living creatures, an insistence on completeness ancient Near Eastern readers would have recognized instantly. This vision claimed authority over every direction, the whole of creation, all at once. Then Ezekiel looked down, and beside each of the 4 living creatures he saw something resting on the ground, a wheel, one for each creature, each wheel with 4 faces of its own. The color of the wheels, he wrote, was like beryl, a pale yellow-green gemstone prized since antiquity, the very same stone later set into the breastplate of Israel's own high priest. But these were no ordinary wheels. All 4 shared one strange design, the appearance and the workmanship of a wheel set inside another wheel, turning within it. When the creatures moved, the wheels moved beside them, on any of their 4 sides, without turning to change direction, because the spirit of the living creature, Ezekiel says, was inside the wheel itself. And when the creatures lifted off the ground, the wheels lifted with them. They rose and fell together, in perfect unison, as though they were, in some sense, a single living thing made of fire and metal. The rims of the 4 wheels, Ezekiel wrote, were tall, and they were dreadful, terrifying to look at, and all 4 rims were full of eyes, all the way around. Modern readers often assume the eyes here are poetic exaggeration. The Hebrew text does not read that way. It repeats the detail twice, in 2 separate visions years apart, insisting plainly that the wheels were, quite literally, covered in eyes. Historians have long noticed how closely this description echoes something Ezekiel, a priest raised near Jerusalem's temple, would have seen almost daily in Babylon, the colossal guardian statues lining the gates of the empire's grandest palaces. Those guardians, called lamassu, combined the body of a bull or lion, the wings of an eagle, and the bearded face of a man, the very same combination Ezekiel gives his living creatures. He was describing the holiest thing he had ever seen in the only visual language his world had given him. Above the heads of the 4 creatures, Ezekiel says, was something like a great vault, and its color was like terrible, awesome crystal, stretched out over them. Under that crystal vault their wings were stretched straight out, one toward another, 2 wings extended to touch the wing of the next, and 2 more folded to cover the body. When they moved, Ezekiel says, the sound of their wings was like the sound of great rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty himself, like the roaring noise of an entire army on the march. And when they stood still, they lowered their wings, and the whole overwhelming sky of fire and motion went suddenly, completely silent. Then a voice came from above the crystal vault, from beyond the wings, from somewhere higher still than anything Ezekiel had yet described. Above the vault, Ezekiel says, was the likeness of a throne, and its appearance was like a sapphire stone, deep and impossibly blue. And on the likeness of the throne was a likeness, as it were, of the appearance of a man, high above it all, wrapped in light too overwhelming to look upon directly. This is the moment Ezekiel is careful, almost frightened, never to describe a face. From the waist up, he says only that it looked like glowing metal, like fire enclosed all around. From the waist down, fire, and brightness on every side. The brightness surrounding the figure, Ezekiel writes, was like the appearance of a rainbow in a cloud on a rainy day. That, he says plainly, was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When Ezekiel saw it, he fell face down on the ground. And then, he says, he heard a voice speaking to him. The voice told him to stand. Son of man, stand on your feet, and I will speak with you. A spirit entered him, he says, and lifted him upright. He was told he was being sent, not to a foreign people whose language he could not understand, but to his own nation, a people the text itself calls rebellious, obstinate, and hard-hearted. Whether they listen or refuse to listen, the voice told him, they will know that a prophet has been among them. Do not be afraid of them, though briars and thorns surround you, though you sit among scorpions. Then, Ezekiel says, a hand stretched out toward him, holding a scroll, written on the front and on the back, filled entirely with words of lamentation, mourning, and woe. He was told to eat it. Ezekiel opened his mouth, and the scroll of grief and judgment, he says, tasted in his mouth as sweet as honey. From that day forward, Ezekiel was made a watchman for the house of Israel, bound to warn his people of the disaster now closing in on Jerusalem from the east. Ezekiel was not the only prophet given a vision like this. Decades earlier, Isaiah had seen God's throne surrounded by 6-winged seraphim crying out, "Holy, holy, holy," so overwhelming that the very doorposts shook. Isaiah's vision terrified even the prophet himself. "Woe is me," he cried out, "for I am a man of unclean lips, standing in the presence of something his own words could barely survive describing." And centuries later still, in the very last book of the Bible, John describes 4 living creatures around God's throne in Revelation, full of eyes, with the same 4 faces of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle, almost word for word. The vision did not end for Ezekiel by the canal, either. Years later, in a second vision, he says he was carried in spirit all the way back to Jerusalem, into the temple itself, where the same beings appeared again. This time Ezekiel finally names them outright. Cherubim. He says so plainly, "This is the living creature that I saw by the river Chebar. I knew that they were the cherubim." And in this second vision he adds one detail he had not mentioned before. It was not only the wheel rims covered in eyes. Their entire bodies, backs, hands, and wings, were covered in eyes, all over. Between the cherubim, Ezekiel saw what looked like burning coals of fire. A hand reached in among them, filled both hands with the coals, and scattered them out over the doomed city below. Then, in the single most devastating line in the entire book, Ezekiel watched the glory of the Lord rise up from above the cherub, pause briefly at the threshold of the temple, and then begin to leave. It moved east, out over the Mount of Olives, away from the temple, away from the city, away from Jerusalem entirely. God, in other words, had already left before a single Babylonian soldier ever reached Jerusalem's walls. The city fell not because it was abandoned by its enemies, but because it had already been abandoned by its own God. For centuries afterward, Jewish tradition treated the opening chapter of Ezekiel as the most dangerous text in all of Scripture. Rabbis in the early centuries after Christ restricted its study entirely, teaching it privately, to a single mature student at a time, in what became known as the work of the Chariot, the merkavah. Mystics who meditated too deeply on the vision, later legend warned, risked losing their minds entirely, so overwhelming was the imagery of wheels within wheels and eyes without number. Centuries later still, the medieval philosopher Maimonides used this same vision as a cornerstone of his own writing, treating Ezekiel's chariot as Scripture's deepest meditation on the very nature of God. The vision was old enough, and important enough, that a Jewish synagogue built at Dura-Europos in Syria, around 244 AD, painted it directly onto its walls, among the oldest surviving Jewish religious art in existence. More than 1,000 years later, the Renaissance painter Raphael attempted his own version, a small luminous panel now known as the Vision of Ezekiel, God enthroned amid the four living creatures, clouds, and light. Centuries after that, enslaved Africans in America turned the same vision into a spiritual, sung in secret and in worship. Ezekiel saw the wheel, way up in the middle of the air, wheel in a wheel. For them, an impossible, ungraspable vision became a coded promise, sung under the noses of overseers, that deliverance could come from a direction no one expected. In the 20th century, the vision found a very different audience. Writers looking for ancient evidence of alien visitation seized on the wheels, the fire, and the strange coordinated movement, and read the whole chapter as a landing spacecraft. But nothing in the ancient world had a word for a machine like that, because nothing like that existed yet. What Ezekiel had was the language of storm, fire, wings, and the guardian statues towering over Babylon's own gates. That was the only vocabulary his world had ever given him for describing something too vast, too holy, and too strange for plain words to hold. 26 centuries later, no film, no painting, and no song has ever fully captured what one exiled priest says he saw beside a muddy Babylonian canal. Wheels within wheels, wings that touched from end to end, a rim covered edge to edge in eyes, and, above it all, a brightness Ezekiel refused to even call a face. Ezekiel himself gives the whole overwhelming vision only one final, humble label, the same one every reader has had to settle for ever since, the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. Not a machine, not a myth invented from nothing, a prophet's honest, halting attempt to describe the indescribable, in the only words a human being has ever had. Perhaps that is the real point of the wheel. Not a puzzle to be decoded, but a reminder that the God of Scripture cannot be reduced to a single fixed image, a God who moves in every direction at once, and never turns back. If you want more reverent deep dives into the strangest, most overwhelming visions in Scripture, subscribe to the Sacred Chronicle, and join us next time.